I handed her my laminated call for fire card 8 minutes into the engagement, when the primary net was down and both platoons were pinned and the fire mission requests were stacking on a handset nobody in the tent wanted to touch. I slid it across the folding table without a word, a courtesy, I told myself. A professional gesture. She was 62 years old, she had been parked at that table 3 days earlier by a lieutenant colonel who laughed at her call sign, and I had said nothing when he laughed. The card was the least I could do. She glanced at it once. Set it aside. Picked up the handset and started talking. I didn't understand what I was watching for another 4 hours and 14 minutes. By the time I did, the card was still sitting where I'd put it, face up on the table, untouched. She never needed it. She never needed me. That's what I think about when I hear a man make assumptions about age. Lieutenant Colonel Harmon arrived at FOB Aldrin 7 on a Tuesday, 9 hours ahead of his household gear and 3 days ahead of his actual read-in on the theater. He made the rounds of the operations tent with his hands behind his back, reading name tapes and billets off the board like a man who preferred to find problems before they found him. He got to the fire support coordination section and stopped. The board listed 4 billets. 3 had names he recognized. The 4th read Briar Lace, FSCR, with a small notation below it in black marker, Topographic Survey Specialist, Peacetime File. He looked at that notation for a moment. Then he looked at her. She was sitting at the coordination table with a set of hand-drawn grids spread flat under a strip of clear acetate, annotating range brackets in pencil. Mid-50s from a distance, early 60s up close, short gray hair, lean, efficient hands. She did not look up when he stopped. Briar Lace, he said, reading it off the board like a question. She looked up then. What is that? He said, a gardening club. There were 14 people in that tent. I was one of them. Every one of us heard it. A few of the junior NCOs found something to look at on the far wall. I was the senior man in the section, and I did not speak. I told myself it wasn't my place. A lieutenant colonel making an observation, that wasn't a fight worth picking on day one. She said nothing. Just watched him. There was no anger in it and no performance. She just held her place the way a person holds their place when they have been in this particular room before, in one form or another, and have learned that the room does not change by arguing with the furniture. He looked at the peacetime file notation again, tracing the words with one finger as if the letters themselves were the problem. How long have you been in the billet? 11 months, she said. Prior assignment. Survey element, 7th group. Before that, V-Corps fire support. He nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already decided. I knew the nod. I had given that nod myself, to other people, in other tents, and I am not proud of knowing it as well as I do. I'm going to move you to rear area mapping support. We've got a gap there, and frankly the forward coordination billet needs someone with a current digital certification. He paused, something in his face that I think he believed was courtesy. No offense. She did not tell him there was no offense to take. She did not argue, did not produce a folder, did not explain that her classification supplement existed and had simply never been forwarded in the command transition. She folded her acetate strip carefully, set it on top of her grids, and moved to the folding table at the rear of the tent. The folding table was used for overflow paperwork, after-action notes, supply manifests, administrative backlog. It had a chair with one short leg and a handset that connected to the secondary analog net, which nobody used because nobody trusted analog in a digital theater. She set her grids on the table and went back to her pencil. I watched her do it and I thought, that's a woman who knows she's been shelved. I thought the colonel was probably right about the digital certification gap, and that she'd put in her time and nobody had thought to update her quals, and that this was how careers ended, not with a bang, but with a lateral move to the folding table. I thought all of this and I went back to my work. 3 days later the ambush hit. The contact came in at 0347, 2 platoons on a route clearing operation in the Halden Corridor, a stretch of ridgeline and switchback road that ran through a sector nobody had good imagery on because the satellite pass angle was wrong and the terrain folded in a way that swallowed drone feeds. Both platoons were in the fold when the first shots came. They went to ground in a constricted kill zone with one approach and no covered egress, and the platoon leader on the primary net was calling for fire support within 90 seconds of first contact. The primary fire net went down at 0351. A relay antenna on the east ridge took a secondary fragment from the first enemy volley, bad luck, wrong placement, and the digital link dropped. The backup relay was 10 kilometers south, outside effective range for the sector we needed. What we had left was the secondary analog handset and whatever maps were in the tent. I went for the maps. The theater imagery on the Halden corridor was 18 months old and showed a road that had since been rerouted. The topographic overlays in the digital system were locked behind the crashed net. What was on the table, the folding table at the rear, were 11 sheets of hand-drawn grids on heavy vellum paper, penciled in small precise numbers, with range brackets and elevation notations and azimuth corrections written in margins so tight I needed my reading glasses to follow them. She had already picked up the handset. "Who's got the mission request?" she said. Not loud. Just clear. I gave it to her. I also slid her the laminated card, my standard call for fire reference, the one I'd carried for 9 years. Range tables, correction formulas, the adjustment sequence in full. I told myself it was a professional courtesy. I told myself she'd need it. She looked at it once. Set it to the side of her grids. Started talking to the platoon leader on the analog net. What came next, I am going to describe as plainly as I can, because I was there and I still want to underline every word with something that isn't a word. She worked the Halden corridor from memory and hand-drawn reference. Her grids were not copies of the theater overlays, they were original survey data, ground truth measurements she had taken herself during a 6-month survey element assignment 7 years earlier, before the road reroute, before the imagery got stale. She knew where every fold in that terrain went. She knew the elevation delta between the ridgeline and the approach cut. She knew, by pencil notation in the corner of grid sheet 4, that the standard fire tables overstated safe clearance on the north face by 60 meters because of a rock shelf that wasn't on any official map. She fired the first mission at 0359. Adjusted on the second round and sent a correction that landed within 40 meters of the platoon leader's call. He came back on the net and said, "Good effect, shift and repeat." His voice was the voice of a man who had just been given a reason to believe he was going to live. She did not reply with anything except the next transmission. I stopped doing other things at approximately 0415. I just watched her work. She ran the missions with no digital display, no computed firing data, no relay. She used the analog handset, the hand-drawn grids, and whatever she had stored in her head about that terrain across 7 years of distance from it. She built a real-time firing picture by ear, calling for adjustment reports, integrating the platoon leader's corrections, anticipating the drift pattern on the indirect fire based on wind data she was reading off a handheld gauge she produced from somewhere in her kit. Between missions she penciled adjustments to her own grids in the margins, updating her picture as new information came in. It was not dramatic. It was completely methodical. It was the most sustained and disciplined professional performance I had witnessed in 22 years of fire support work, and it was happening at a folding table with one short leg in the rear of a tent while the colonel who laughed at her call sign slept 400 meters away. Around the fourth mission I became aware that she was also tracking both platoons' positions simultaneously, not just the fire geometry, but the ground situation, calling for position updates every time the platoon leader had 30 seconds between transmissions. She was building a running picture of where the two elements were relative to each other and to her impact points, adjusting the safety buffer dynamically as they moved. I have coordinated fire support in 3 combat theaters. I had never seen anyone manage that picture without a display in front of them. She was doing it from memory and margin notes, and when I leaned in close enough to look at her grids I saw that the pencil notations she'd been adding during the engagement were not corrections, they were position plots, updated every few minutes, a hand-built tracker running in real time on paper. At 0611 the 6th platoon report came in, both elements had consolidated on a defensible piece of ground and were holding. QRF was 40 minutes out. She had bought them that time. 11 fire missions in 2 hours and 20 minutes and both platoons were alive and moving. She kept working. The QRF arrived at 0648. By 0712 both platoons were on the extraction route, moving south out of the corridor. The last fire mission she ran was at 0809, covering the extraction's western flank against a secondary element that tried to cut the route. I watched her call that one. The grid she used placed the impact point at 8,400 meters, a range that, on paper, sits outside the reliable adjustment envelope for analog-only fire coordination. No digital solution, no computed data, no relay confirmation. She called it in one adjustment. The second round landed with effect and the western element broke contact and did not try again. I looked at my laminated card sitting face up on the table beside her grids. She had not touched it once in 4 hours and 22 minutes. I picked it up and put it back in my breast pocket, and I did not say anything because there was nothing adequate to say. The formal AAR came 5 days later. Brigade Fire Support Coordinator, Lieutenant Colonel Serrano, ran it. He had the fire log printed and distributed and read it entry by entry, timestamp, grid, adjustment called, correction reported, effect achieved. Reading 11 fire missions in full takes a specific kind of time. The room was quiet in the way rooms get when people are counting something and the count keeps going higher than they expected. Harmon sat at the near end of the table with his hands folded. He had been quiet since the morning after the engagement, when someone put a handwritten summary of the fire log on his desk without annotation. I don't know who did that. I have my suspicions. Serrano reached entry 11. He read the grid aloud. He read the range notation. He read the single adjustment confirmation. He got to the effect report, 1 adjustment, effect achieved, and he stopped. The room was very quiet. Serrano looked up from the log. He looked at her, seated at the far end of the table with her hands flat on the surface, watching him with the same expression she'd had when Harmon read her call sign off the board 3 days before the ambush. Level. Patient. Not waiting for anything in particular. Serrano stood up. He didn't announce it. He didn't say a word. He just pushed his chair back and stood. The 2 officers to his right stood. Then the ones beside them. Then every man in that room was on his feet, and the last one up was Harmon, who rose slowly, hands dropping to his sides, his eyes on the table in front of him rather than on her. She sat for a moment. Then she nodded once, the deliberate nod of someone who has received a correct answer to a question she had been waiting on, and she reached forward and picked up her pencil and wrote something small in the margin of the page in front of her. I have never asked what she wrote. I think about it, but I don't ask. Some corrections belong to the person making them. I still carry the laminated card. It lives in my left breast pocket on every operation, same place it's been for 9 years. I don't carry it because I need it. I've had the data memorized for longer than I care to admit. I carry it because it reminds me of what I handed her, and what she did with it, which was nothing, because she didn't need my version of the terrain. She had her own. She had always had her own, drawn in pencil on 11 sheets of heavy vellum, maintained by hand across 7 years, because a woman who knows a piece of ground that well doesn't let the knowing go to waste just because no one else thought to update her file. The card has a small dent in the upper right corner from where it spent 4 hours and 22 minutes on a folding table beside grids that made it unnecessary. I have never flattened that dent out. I don't intend to.